He was a forgotten veteran, invisible to his town, until one small act of kindness sparked a storm of betrayal and hope. Stay to uncover a tale that'll grip your heart. Like, subscribe, hit the bell for stories that haunt and heal. The morning sun barely broke through the grey haze over Millhaven, a small town nestled in Pennsylvania's rolling hills. 65-year-old Thomas Weaver trudged along Main Street, his boots scuffing the cracked sidewalk. His faded green military jacket hung loose on his thin frame, its frayed cuffs brushing against calloused hands. A silver beard framed his weathered face, and his grey eyes, though tired, held a flicker of stubborn hope. Thomas was a fixture here, like the rusted lampposts or the diner's flickering neon sign. He'd been a mill worker once, back when the town had jobs to offer. Now, he was just the old vet, collecting cans for pennies and sleeping in the alley behind St. Mary's Church when the nights grew too cold. The townsfolk knew little about him, only that he'd served in Vietnam decades ago, and that he kept to himself. His canvas bag, slung over one shoulder, clinked softly with the day's haul of bottles. The air smelled of damp leaves and fresh bread from Harper's Bakery, a scent that twisted his empty stomach. Thomas didn't beg. Never had. His army days had drilled self-reliance into his bones, even if those bones ached now from years of sleeping on concrete. He'd lost his wife, Clara, to a heart attack 15 years ago. The VA's endless paperwork and missteps had left him with nothing but grief and a distrust of systems. He'd sold their small house, given the money to a local shelter Clara loved, and walked away from the life he'd known. Easier to be nobody, he'd once muttered to a curious priest, than somebody who couldn't save her. Yet, every morning, Thomas rose with the dawn, his routine a quiet act of defiance against a world that had forgotten him. He nodded to Mrs. Harper, sweeping her bakery's stoop, her apron dusted with flour. "Morning, Thomas," she called, her voice kind but distant. He tipped his head, saying nothing, and kept walking. The town saw his silence as pride, maybe stubbornness. But to Thomas, it was survival, keeping the pain locked away where it couldn't unravel him. His dreams, once filled with Clara's laughter, now held flashes of jungle gunfire and friends he'd buried. Still, he carried on, finding small joys in the sunrise or the stray cats that curled up beside him at night. Today, though, something felt different. The air was sharper, the wind carrying a bite that promised early snow. Thomas adjusted his bag, his fingers brushing the worn dog tags tucked beneath his shirt. He didn't know it yet, but this day would crack open the life he'd built from scraps, exposing both its fragility and its strength. Catalyst. By noon, Thomas had wandered to Prospect Park, a patchy green space at Millhaven's edge. The park was quiet, its swings creaking in the breeze, the grass worn thin by years of neglect. He settled on a rusted bench, its paint peeling like old skin, and pulled a crumpled newspaper from his bag to read. The headlines blurred. Politics, wars, things he couldn't change. He sighed, his breath visible in the chilly air, and set the paper aside. That's when he noticed the boy. A skinny kid, maybe 10, stood near a gnarled oak tree, clutching a tattered notebook. His brown hair was a mess, his oversized sweater fraying at the sleeves, the cuffs too long for his small hands. His sneakers were scuffed, one lace untied, dragging in the dirt. The boy's eyes, wide and wary, darted around the park as if expecting trouble. Thomas watched him for a moment, recognizing the look of someone who felt out of place. The kid wasn't local. Thomas knew every face in Millhaven, and this one was new. He hesitated, then reached into his bag, pulling out a paper sack Mrs. Harper had slipped him earlier. Half a muffin, still soft, wrapped in wax paper. "Hey, kid," Thomas called, his voice rough from disuse. The boy froze, gripping his notebook tighter, but didn't run. "You hungry?" Thomas held out the sack, keeping his distance to avoid spooking him. The boy's eyes flicked to the bag, then back to Thomas, weighing the offer. Slowly, he shuffled closer, his sneakers scuffing the grass. He took the sack with trembling hands, muttering, "Thanks, mister." His voice was small, almost lost in the wind. Thomas nodded, saying nothing more, and turned back to his newspaper. The boy sat cross-legged on the grass a few feet away, tearing into the muffin like he hadn't eaten in days. Thomas pretended not to notice, but his chest tightened. He'd seen hunger before, in war, in the streets, in the mirror. The kid didn't owe him an explanation, and Thomas didn't ask for one. Some things, he knew, were better left unsaid. As the boy ate, Thomas caught a glimpse of the notebook's cover, scribbled with pencil sketches of birds and trees. The kid had talent, a spark of something unbroken. For the first time that day, Thomas felt a flicker of purpose, like a match struck in the dark. Start of deepening connection. Over the next few days, the boy appeared in the park each afternoon, always with his notebook, always alone. Thomas began to look for him, his routine shifting to include these quiet encounters. He'd sit on the same bench, reading or sorting cans, while the boy lingered nearby, sketching or staring at the clouds. Thomas kept a small stash of food, bread crusts, an apple from the church pantry, ready to share. The boy never asked, but he always accepted, his "thanks, mister" growing steadier, less guarded. One grey afternoon, as rain threatened, the boy sat closer, under the bench's splintered awning. Thomas noticed a bruise on the kid's wrist, faint but unmistakable, peeking from his sleeve. He didn't comment, but his jaw tightened. He'd seen marks like that before, on soldiers hiding pain, on Clara when her illness stole her strength. Instead of prying, Thomas pulled a stubby pencil from his bag, sharpened with a pocket knife, and slid it across the bench. "Yours looks worn out," he said gruffly. The boy blinked, then took the pencil, his fingers brushing the bench's rough wood. He flipped open his notebook, revealing a sketch of the park's oak tree, its branches twisting like veins. "That's good," Thomas said, meaning it. The boy's face lit up, a shy smile breaking through. "Used to draw with my mom," he mumbled, barely audible. "She's gone now." Thomas nodded, his throat tight. "Mine too," he said simply. No more words were needed. The rain began to fall, pattering on the awning, and they sat in silence. The boy sketching, Thomas watching the droplets pool on the grass. The kid's trust was fragile, like a bird learning to land, and Thomas respected it. He didn't push, didn't ask about the bruise or the absent parents. But he started saving the best of his meagre finds, a shiny bottle cap, a smooth stone, for the boy's pockets, small gifts that cost nothing but meant everything. Each exchange deepened their bond, a quiet understanding growing between two souls the world had overlooked. Thomas didn't know the boy's story, but he saw himself in those wary eyes, a survivor, clinging to hope despite the odds. The days turned colder in Millhaven, the wind carrying the sharp tang of approaching winter. Thomas Weaver's routine now revolved around the boy in the park, their quiet moments stitching together a fragile bond. Each afternoon, he'd find the kid, 10 years old, messy brown hair, always in that oversized sweater, near the oak tree, sketching in his tattered notebook. Thomas brought whatever he could scrounge. A bruised pear from the church pantry, a crusty roll from Mrs. Harper's day-old bin. The boy, who'd finally mumbled his name as Eli, accepted the offerings with a nod, his wary eyes softening. One chilly evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the park in hues of amber and grey, Eli sat closer on the rusted bench. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke from a distant chimney. Thomas noticed Eli's sneakers, the soles peeling, one toe poking through. Without a word, he pulled a roll of duct tape from his canvas bag, kept for patching his own boots, and handed it over. "Fix those up," Thomas said gruffly. Eli's fingers, smudged with pencil lead, worked the tape clumsily, but he managed a lopsided repair. "Thanks, mister," he said, his voice small but steady. Thomas caught a glimpse of Eli's latest sketch, a sparrow perched on a barbed wire fence, its feathers ruffled against a stormy sky. The detail was striking, the kind of care that came from seeing the world too closely. "You got a gift, kid," Thomas said, his tone matter-of-fact. Eli's cheeks flushed, and he ducked his head, but a smile tugged at his lips. They didn't talk much, but the silence was comfortable, like soldiers sharing a foxhole. Thomas learned bits of Eli's world through scraps. A mention of a foster home, a teacher who'd praised his art, a mum who'd loved birds before she went away. The bruises on Eli's wrists faded, but new ones appeared, faint shadows under his sleeves. Thomas never asked outright. He knew the weight of shame, but he watched, his army-honed instincts alert. One day, Eli dropped a crumpled photo from his notebook, a young woman with Eli's brown eyes laughing in a sunflower field. Thomas picked it up, the glossy paper worn soft, and handed it back. "She's pretty," he said simply. Eli clutched the photo, whispering, "She used to sing to me." Thomas nodded, his throat tight, remembering Clara's voice humming in their kitchen. He pulled a smooth riverstone from his pocket, one he'd found by the creek, and pressed it into Eli's palm. Hold on to the good stuff, he said. Eli's fingers closed around the stone, and for a moment the park felt like a sanctuary, shielding them from the world's sharp edges. Thomas didn't know how much time they had, but he vowed to keep showing up, to be the steady hand Eli could count on. Reactions of the community. Word spread slowly in Millhaven, carried on whispers in the diner or glances at the grocery store. Thomas, the quiet vet who'd always been a shadow, was suddenly noticed. Mrs. Harper, wiping flour from her hands, mentioned to customers how Thomas shared her day-old bread with some kid. At the barber shop, old men swapping stories speculated about the boy's origins. Runaway, orphan, troublemaker. Some saw Thomas's kindness as noble, a flicker of the town's better days. "Man's got nothing, but he's feeding a kid," said Joe, the hardware store owner, nodding approval. Others weren't so kind. At the town's weekly market, Mrs. Callahan, a sharp-tongued retiree, scoffed as Thomas passed, his bag clinking with cans. "He's probably scamming that boy for sympathy," she said loudly, her voice carrying over the smell of apples and cider. "Veterans always got an angle." A few nodded, their skepticism rooted in years of small-town distrust. Thomas heard the murmurs but kept his head down, his boots scuffing the pavement. He'd faced worse than gossip, jungle ambushes, Clara's slow fade. But the words stung, chipping at the armour he'd built. At St. Mary's Church, Father Daniel, who'd known Thomas for years, pulled him aside after Sunday service. The church smelled of wax and old hymnals, its pews creaking under the weight of the congregation. "People are talking, Thomas," the priest said gently. "Some think you're stirring trouble, getting involved with that boy." Thomas's jaw tightened, his fingers brushing the dog tags under his shirt. "Just giving him what I can," he said, his voice low. Father Daniel nodded, but his eyes held worry. "Be careful. Not everyone sees the good in what you're doing." The mixed reactions weighed on Thomas, but he pushed them aside. Eli's shy smiles, the way he clutched that riverstone, were worth more than the town's approval. Still, a betrayal lingered in the air. Not from one person, but from the system that had left him scraping by, and now judged him for daring to care. Millhaven had forgotten its veterans, its mills, its sense of community. Thomas felt the isolation deepen, a familiar ache from years of being invisible. Yet, every afternoon he returned to the park, his canvas bag heavier with hope than cans. Trial of kindness. Trouble arrived on a bitter November morning, the sky heavy with the threat of snow. Thomas was sorting cans behind the diner when Mr. Grayson, the diner's owner, stormed out, his apron stained with grease. The air reeked of burnt coffee and rotting trash from the dumpster. "Thomas, you gotta stop this," Grayson snapped, his voice sharp. "You're attracting strays. First that kid, now others sniffing around my scraps." Thomas straightened, his back stiff from the cold, and met Grayson's glare. "Just sharing what I got," he said evenly. Grayson's face reddened. "You're not a charity, Weaver. I'm running a business. Customers are complaining about vagrants hanging around." Thomas's fingers tightened on his bag, the canvas rough against his palm. He'd known Grayson for years, even fixed his truck once for free. The accusation cut deep, but Thomas held his ground. "I'll stay clear," he said, his voice steady but laced with hurt. Grayson hesitated, then muttered, "Good," and stumped back inside. The encounter shook Thomas more than he'd admit. He'd sacrificed his pride long ago. But this felt personal, a rejection of the one thing he still offered: kindness. That afternoon, he found Eli in the park, shivering under his thin sweater. Thomas pulled a wool scarf from his bag, one Clara had knitted, its edges frayed but warm, and draped it over Eli's shoulders. "Keep it," he said gruffly, ignoring the pang of giving away Clara's work. Eli's eyes widened, his fingers tracing the scarf's soft weave. "You sure, mister?" he asked, voice trembling. Thomas nodded, forcing a smile. The act grounded him, a reminder of why he kept going. But the trial wasn't over. Later at the market, Mrs. Callahan cornered him, her voice dripping with scorn. "Saw you giving that kid a scarf? What's next, your jacket? You're making us all look bad, Weaver." Thomas's chest tightened, but he didn't reply. He walked away, the market's chatter fading behind him, his boots crunching on gravel. The scarf was a small price, but the town's judgment felt like a theft of something deeper: his dignity. Still, he resolved to keep showing up for Eli, no matter the cost. Escalation of conflict. The tension in Millhaven thickened like the snow now dusting the streets. Thomas's quiet acts of kindness, once invisible, had become a lightning rod. At the barber shop, Men grumbled that Thomas was enabling Eli, encouraging a runaway to linger. Mrs. Callahan's gossip spread, painting Thomas as a reckless do-gooder, maybe even a danger. She says he's got no business playing hero, a cashier whispered at the grocery store, her voice low over the hum of the register. Thomas felt the stares as he walked Main Street, his jacket heavier with the weight of scrutiny. The betrayal stung most from those he'd known for years. Joe, the hardware store owner who'd once praised him, now avoided his eyes, muttering about keeping the peace. Even Father Daniel's sermons began to skirt around charity, as if wary of fueling the debate. Thomas's doubts grew, gnawing at him in the quiet hours. Had he been wrong to help Eli? Was he stirring trouble, as they said? His dreams, already haunted by war, now mixed with Clara's voice, urging him to hold fast. But the town's rejection was relentless. One evening, as Thomas left the park, two teenagers, local troublemakers with sneers to match, blocked his path. The street was dark, the air sharp with the smell of diesel from a passing truck. "Old man, you think you're some saint?" one jeered, tossing a soda can at Thomas's feet. It clattered on the pavement, the sound echoing in the empty street. Thomas's fists clenched, his army training flickering, but he forced himself to walk away. "Keep your junk," he muttered, his voice low. The teens laughed, but their taunts followed him, each word a reminder of his place, the forgotten vet, now a target. At night, in the church alley, Thomas sat on his cardboard bed, the cold seeping through his jacket. He pulled out Clara's old locket, its silver tarnished but warm in his hand. "Am I doing right by you, Clara?" he whispered, his voice cracking. The locket held a photo of her smiling, a memory of the life they'd dreamed of. The town's scorn, the loss of Grayson's trust, the teen's cruelty, it all pressed down, threatening to break him. Yet Eli's face, bright with that shy smile, kept him tethered. Thomas didn't know how much longer he could hold on, but he wouldn't abandon the kid. Not yet. The conflict was far from over, and Millhaven's judgment was about to push him to the edge. The first snow blanketed Millhaven, turning the streets into a quiet white canvas. Thomas Weaver's breath clouded in the icy air as he trudged to Prospect Park, his boots crunching through the fresh powder. His faded green military jacket was dusted with snow, the frayed cuffs stiff with cold. The park was empty, the rusted bench buried under a thin layer of white, its peeling paint hidden for now. Thomas's canvas bag clinked softly, lighter today. He'd given most of his scavenged food to Eli the day before. His chest was heavy, not just from the cold, but from the weight of the town's growing scorn. Mrs. Callahan's gossip had spread like wildfire, twisting his kindness into something suspicious, reckless. The barbershop murmurs, the teenagers' taunts, even Grayson's betrayal at the diner. They'd chipped away at him, leaving cracks in the resolve he'd clung to for years. He settled on the bench, brushing snow from the armrest, the metal icy against his calloused fingers. Eli would be here soon, he told himself. The kid's shy smile, his sketches, the way he clutched Clara's scarf. Those were the anchors keeping Thomas afloat. But as minutes stretched into an hour, the park remained silent. The oak tree's bare branches stark against the grey sky. No Eli, no scuffed sneakers or oversized sweater. Just the wind, whistling through the swings, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke. Thomas's stomach twisted, a mix of worry and dread. He'd seen Eli's bruises, the way the kid flinched at loud noises. Had something happened at the foster home? Had Thomas pushed too far, giving him hope only to leave him vulnerable? His hands clenched, the rough canvas of his bag digging into his palms. "Damn it, kid," he muttered, his voice breaking. He stood, pacing the snow-dusted grass, his eyes scanning the park's edges. The cold seeped into his bones, but the ache in his chest was worse. A raw, helpless fear he hadn't felt since Clara's final days. He'd failed her, lost her to a system that didn't care. Now, Eli was slipping through his fingers, and Thomas felt the same powerlessness creeping in. He sank back onto the bench, his head in his hands, snow melting into his silver beard. "I tried, Clara," he whispered, his voice a ragged sob. "I tried to do right." The park blurred as tears stung his eyes, the first he'd shed in years. His kindness, the one thing he'd held on to, felt like a betrayal now, his own betrayal of a boy who'd trusted him. The world had turned its back on Thomas, and now it seemed so had Eli. He was alone again, just a forgotten vet in a town that didn't want him. Unexpected absence. The next day, Thomas returned to the park, his heart heavy but stubborn. The snow had thickened, blanketing the bench and muffling the town's usual hum. He waited, his breath visible, his fingers numb inside his threadbare gloves. No Eli. The oak tree stood silent, its branches sagging under the weight of snow. Thomas's worry hardened into a gnawing fear. He'd never asked where Eli lived, respecting the kid's privacy, but now that choice haunted him. Had Eli run away? Been taken? The bruises flashed in Thomas's mind, each one a question he hadn't dared ask. He walked the park's perimeter, his boots leaving deep tracks, the air sharp with the scent of pine and frost. At the market, he scanned the crowd, hoping to spot Eli's messy brown hair or frayed sweater. Nothing. Mrs. Harper, sweeping her bakery's stoop, caught his eye. "You looking for that boy?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. Thomas nodded, his throat tight. "Haven't seen him," she said, frowning. "Folks say he's a runaway. Maybe he moved on." The words hit like a punch. Moved on. Thomas's jaw clenched, his fingers brushing the dog tags under his shirt. He didn't believe it. Eli wouldn't leave without a word, not after their quiet bond. But doubt crept in, cold as the snow soaking his boots. Had he misread the kid? Was Eli just another soul passing through, like the stray cats Thomas fed? That evening, he sat in the church alley, his cardboard bed damp from the snow. The alley smelled of wet brick and stale coffee from the diner's vents. He pulled out Clara's locket, its silver glinting in the dim streetlight. "Where are you, kid?" he whispered, his voice lost in the wind. Eli's absence was a wound, raw and aching, deepening the isolation Thomas had fought for years. The town's judgment, the system's neglect, his own grief, they'd all led to this moment, where even his small act of kindness seemed to crumble. He clutched the locket tighter, willing himself to keep going, but the emptiness was suffocating. Public condemnation? Millhaven's whispers turned into a roar. Without Eli to anchor Thomas's actions, the town's skepticism hardened into outright condemnation. At the diner, Grayson posted a sign, "No loitering, keep moving." It wasn't aimed at customers, Thomas knew. It was for him. The words stung, a public shaming from a man he'd once called a friend. Mrs. Callahan's gossip reached new heights, her voice carrying through the market like a siren. "He was probably up to no good with that kid," she declared, her arms crossed, her scarf flapping in the wind. Who knows what he was teaching him? Stealing, maybe. A small crowd nodded, their faces a mix of pity and disgust. Thomas, sorting cans nearby, heard every word, his hands trembling as he stuffed bottles into his bag. The air smelled of apples and resentment, the market's chatter a dull roar in his ears. He wanted to shout, to tell them Eli was just a kid who needed someone. But his voice stayed locked inside, the weight of their judgment too heavy. The betrayal cut deepest from the system he'd served. A local paper ran a story. Homeless vet questioned in boy's disappearance. It was thin on facts, heavy on insinuation, quoting Mrs. Callahan and anonymous, concerned citizens. Thomas saw the headline on a newsstand, his weathered face staring back from a grainy photo. The words twisted his kindness into something sinister, accusing him without proof. At the church, Father Daniel pulled him aside again, his face grim. "Thomas, the police came by. They're asking about you and the boy." Thomas's heart sank, his fingers gripping his bag. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice low but firm. "I know," Father Daniel replied, but his eyes held doubt, a crack in the trust they'd built. That night, as Thomas walked Main Street, a group of teens, emboldened by the article, threw snowballs laced with gravel. One hit his shoulder, the sting shot through his jacket. "Creep!" one shouted, their laughter echoing in the dark. Thomas kept walking, his head down, the snow soaking his boots. The town he'd lived in for decades had turned on him, seeing not a veteran or a man, but a threat. His kindness, the one thing he'd clung to, was now a noose around his neck. Personal reflection. Alone in the church alley, Thomas sat on his damp cardboard, the cold biting through his jacket. The streetlight flickered, casting jagged shadows on the brick wall, the air heavy with the smell of snow and diesel. His hands shook as he pulled Clara's locket from his pocket, its silver worn smooth from years of touch. He opened it, revealing her smiling face, her eyes bright with the dreams they'd shared. A small house, a garden, a life built on love. Those dreams had died with her, buried under the VA's red tape and his own grief. Now, Eli's absence threatened to bury the last spark of purpose he'd found. "Clara, I thought I was doing right," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I thought I could help him." The locket's hinge creaked, a faint sound in the silent night. He closed his eyes, memories flooding in. Clara's laughter, the jungle's heat, the weight of a rifle in his hands. In Vietnam, he'd carried wounded men to safety, refusing to leave anyone behind. No man left behind, he'd vowed, a creed that had kept him alive. But the system had left him behind. Denied benefits, lost paperwork, endless waits. He'd walked away, choosing the streets over a bureaucracy that failed Clara. Now, Millhaven was doing the same, judging him for daring to care. He thought of Eli's sketches, the sparrow on the barbed wire, fragile but free. That boy had trusted him, and Thomas had let him down, just like he'd let Clara down. Or had he? A memory surfaced. Clara's voice, soft but firm, the night she'd urged him to keep fighting. You're stronger than you know, Thomas. Don't let the world make you small. He gripped the locket, its edges biting into his palm. Eli wasn't gone for good. He couldn't be. Thomas's kindness wasn't a mistake, even if the town couldn't see it. He'd faced worse than gossip, ambushes, loss, years of invisibility. He'd survived because he refused to quit, and he wouldn't quit now. Tucking the locket away, he stood, his boots crunching in the snow. The alley felt less like a cage, more like a starting point. He didn't know where Eli was, but he'd find him, or at least keep showing up. For Clara, for Eli, for himself. The night was dark, but Thomas's resolve burned brighter, a quiet fire no one could extinguish. The snow fell heavier in Millhaven, cloaking the town in a hush that felt like the world holding its breath. Thomas Weaver woke in the church alley, his breath clouding in the frigid air. His faded green military jacket stiff with frost. His canvas bag, lighter now without food to share, rested against the damp brick wall, the alley's scent of wet stone and stale coffee sharp in his nose. Eli's absence gnawed at him, a wound that deepened with each empty day in Prospect Park. The town's condemnation, the newspaper's lies, Mrs. Callahan's venom, the teen's snowballs, had pushed him to the edge, but Clara's locket, warm against his chest, kept him grounded. He'd resolved to keep searching for Eli, to hold fast to the kindness that defined him. That morning, as he trudged toward the park, his boots crunching through fresh snow, something shifted. A police cruiser idled on Main Street, its lights off, but its presence heavy. Thomas's stomach tightened, his fingers brushing the dog tags under his shirt. He kept walking, head down, until a voice called out, "Mr. Weaver?" He turned to see Officer Daniels, a young cop with a kind face, stepping from the cruiser. The air smelled of exhaust and snow. The street quiet except for the hum of the engine. "We need to talk," Daniels said, his tone gentle but firm. Thomas braced himself, expecting another accusation. But Daniels' eyes held no judgment. "It's about the boy, Eli." Thomas's heart lurched. "Is he okay?" he asked, his voice rough. Daniels nodded. "He's safe. Come with me." At the station, a small brick building that smelled of burnt coffee and old paper, Thomas sat in a cramped office. Across from him was a social worker, Ms. Rivera, her glasses perched on her nose, a file open on her desk. Eli, she explained, had been removed from an abusive foster home after a teacher reported new bruises. He was now in a temporary shelter, safe but shaken. Thomas's fists clenched, relief warring with anger at the system that had failed the kid. Ms. Rivera leaned forward, her voice soft. "Eli's been talking about you, Mr. Weaver. Says you gave him food, a scarf, a pencil. Says you listened." Thomas swallowed, his throat tight. "Just did what anyone would," he muttered. "Not anyone," Ms. Rivera said, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. It was one of Eli's sketches. Thomas on the park bench, his silver beard catching the light, a sparrow perched on his shoulder. The detail was stunning, every wrinkle and frayed thread captured with care. At the bottom, in Eli's shaky handwriting, were the words, "The man who saw me." Thomas's eyes stung, his fingers tracing the paper's rough texture. But the revelation wasn't over. Ms. Rivera pulled another file, this one older, its edges yellowed. "We looked into your records, Mr. Weaver. There was an error with your VA benefits. Paperwork lost during a system change in the 90s. You're owed back pay, medical care, housing support." She paused, her voice steady. "Over $200,000 by our estimate." Thomas stared, the words blurring. He'd given up on the VA years ago, after Clara's death, when their neglect had cost him everything. Now, this, because of Eli, because he'd dared to care. Ms. Rivera smiled faintly. "Eli's sketch got us curious. We dug deeper. You're not just any veteran, Mr. Weaver. Your service record, Bronze Star, Vietnam, saving your unit in '69, It's remarkable. Thomas's jaw tightened, memories of gunfire and blood flashing through his mind. I was just doing my job, he said quietly. Ms. Rivera shook her head. You've been doing more than that. For Eli. For this town. Even if they don't see it yet. The revelation hit like a wave. His kindness, dismissed and mocked, had rippled outward, uncovering truths about himself and Eli that Millhaven could no longer ignore. Catharsis. The next day, Thomas was asked to visit Eli at the shelter, a modest building on Millhaven's outskirts. The air inside smelled of disinfectant and warm bread, a stark contrast to the snowy streets. Eli sat at a table, his notebook open, his oversized sweater replaced by a new one, still too big but clean. When he saw Thomas, his face lit up, a smile breaking through the wariness. "Mister," he called, rushing forward. Thomas knelt, letting Eli hug him, the boy's thin arms surprisingly strong. The scarf, Clara's scarf, still hung around Eli's neck, its frayed edges a testament to their bond. "I thought you were gone," Thomas said, his voice rough with relief. Eli shook his head. "They took me away, but I kept your stone." He pulled the river stone from his pocket, its smooth surface glinting in the fluorescent light. Thomas's chest ached, the weight of the past weeks lifting. Ms. Rivera handed Thomas a letter, sealed in a plain envelope. "Eli wrote this for you," she said. Thomas opened it later, alone in the park, the snow falling softly around the rusted bench. The letter was short, in Eli's careful scrawl. "You made me feel like I wasn't invisible. Thank you for being my friend. I'll keep drawing, like you said." Thomas folded the letter, tucking it beside Clara's locket, his eyes wet but his heart full. The town's judgment still lingered, but Millhaven was starting to shift. Mrs. Callahan, confronted by Ms. Rivera about her gossip, had fallen silent at the market, her face flushed with shame. The local paper printed a retraction, a front-page story titled, "Veteran's Kindness Saves Local Boy." Grayson, the diner owner, approached Thomas outside the church, his apron twisted in his hands. "I was wrong, Weaver," he said, his voice low. "Didn't know the whole story? Your coffee's on me anytime." Thomas nodded, forgiving but not forgetting, his dignity intact. The teens who'd thrown snowballs were assigned community service, cleaning the park under Father Daniel's stern eye. One mumbled an apology, avoiding Thomas's gaze, but it was enough. The catharsis wasn't just Thomas's, it was Eli's, the town's, a shared reckoning with the cost of indifference. Thomas felt Clara's presence, her voice whispering, "You did right." For the first time in years, he believed her. Transformation of the community. Millhaven began to change, slowly but unmistakably, like snow melting under a hesitant sun. The park, once neglected, saw new life. Joe, the hardware store owner, donated paint for the bench, and a group of locals, some who'd once whispered about Thomas, planted flowers around the oak tree. Father Daniel started a weekly food drive at St. Mary's, inspired by Thomas's quiet charity, with a sign that read, "For those who need it, no questions asked." Mrs. Harper baked extra bread, leaving it in a box labelled Weaver's Share. The diner's no loitering sign came down, replaced by a chalkboard offering free coffee to veterans. Eli's story and Thomas's role in it became a touchstone. The local school invited Thomas to speak, his bronze star pinned to his jacket, his voice steady as he told students about service, loss, and kindness. Eli, now in a new foster home with a kind couple, attended, his notebook clutched tight, his sketches of Thomas and the park displayed on a bulletin board. The town council, spurred by the newspaper's expose, launched the Weaver Initiative, a fund to support homeless veterans and foster kids, ensuring no one slipped through the cracks. Ms. Rivera, working with the VA, secured Thomas's back pay and a small apartment near the park, its walls bare but warm, a place to call home. Millhaven's transformation wasn't perfect. Skeptics remained, and old habits died hard. But Thomas's actions had planted a seed. People greeted him on Main Street now, some with nods, others with quiet thank yous. The air smelled of hope, mingled with the usual coffee and snow, a reminder that small acts could shift a town's heart. Thomas, once invisible, had become a mirror, reflecting Millhaven's capacity for change, legacy of kindness. Thomas's life settled into a new rhythm, grounded by purpose. His apartment held few possessions. A bed, a chair, a photo of Clara on the wall, next to Eli's sketch of the sparrow. Each afternoon, he walked to the park, sitting on the newly painted bench, watching kids play where he'd once slept. Eli visited often, his new foster parents encouraging their bond. The boy's sketches grew bolder, his latest a mural on the shelter's wall. Thomas and Eli under the oak tree, a flock of sparrows soaring above. The VA, prompted by Thomas's case, reviewed other veterans' files, uncovering more errors, restoring benefits to dozens. Nationally, his story spread, a viral news segment titled "The Veteran Who Never Gave Up." It sparked debates on veteran care, foster systems, and the power of kindness, with Thomas's face, weather-worn but dignified, becoming a symbol. He declined most interviews, but spoke at a Veterans Day event, his dress uniform tight but proud, his bronze star gleaming. "Kindness ain't weak," he said, his voice clear. "It's what keeps us human." The crowd stood, their applause echoing through Fort Hamilton, a salute to a man who'd carried others, even when he had nothing. Eli, now thriving, sent Thomas a new letter. "You showed me I can be somebody. I'm going to be an artist like Mom wanted." Thomas kept it with Clara's locket, a testament to the legacy he'd built, not just for Eli, but for Millhaven and beyond. His kindness had outlasted the town's scorn, proving that even the smallest acts could ripple forever. He found peace, not in applause, but in the quiet moments. Eli's laughter, the park's new flowers, the warmth of a home. Clara's dream, of a life that mattered, lived on in every step he took. Final image and call to action. On a crisp spring morning, Thomas sat on the park bench, the oak tree budding green above him. His green jacket, still faded but clean, rested on his shoulders, his silver beard catching the sunlight. Eli, now 11, sat beside him, sketching a sparrow that hopped nearby, Clara's scarf loose around his neck. The park hummed with life. Kids laughing, locals planting flowers, the air sweet with grass and hope. Thomas's hand rested on Eli's letter, tucked in his pocket, next to Clara's locket. He smiled, his grey eyes clear, no longer looking down but forward toward a future he'd helped shape. The sparrow took flight, its wings a soft blur, a symbol of the freedom he'd given Eli, himself, and Millhaven. Kindness, he knew, was never too late. It just needed someone patient enough to wait for it. What's your story of kindness that changed everything? Drop it in the comments, share this video, and let's inspire each other. Like, subscribe, hit the bell. Don't miss stories that prove justice and heart always win.